And I looked at Frances and I said, sweetie, are you nervous at all? And she said, why would I be nervous? We're in a crocodile-infested lake, surrounded by angry hippos. The boat has a slow leak, which it did. And she said, I'm loaded down with about $8,000 of very heavy video and camera equipment, and I'm going to go to the bottom like a rock. And I said, well, at least you're not nervous.
Hi there, John McAdams here. Thanks a lot for joining me today in episode 379 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. My summer of 2025 Africa hunting miniseries continues with an appearance by none other than Mike Arnold. Mike literally just returned from a hunt in Mozambique, where among other animals, he took a gigantic crocodile and a spotted hyena using, let's just say, a non-traditional hunting method. But not to worry, Mike and I are going to tell you all about those two hunts in today's episode. Plus, Mike also has a literally brand new book that just dropped summer of 2025 called Bringing Back the Wild. We'll tell you a little bit about this book in today's episode as well. I'll also give you some information on where you can pick up a copy of it. Now, before we get started talking to Mike, I have two important admin notes to briefly talk to you about. So first, if you want to hunt Africa, we still have some availability remaining for a hunt in South Africa, October of 2025. This year is full otherwise. We do have availability in March, April, May, September, October, and November of 2026 for some hunts, either in Limpopo or in the Free State. Visit bestsafarihunt.com for more details or email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com. I will set you up with a great hunt in Africa. And plus, when you contact me, make sure you tell me you are a podcast listener as well. I do give podcast listeners a special bonus when they book hunts with us. Okay, let's get started talking to Mike about his crocodile and hyena hunts. Well, good morning, Mike. Thank you so much for joining me back on the show again today.
Hey, thank you for having me on, John.
It is always a pleasure having you on, even though you joke about how you put everyone to sleep and all that. You're a very popular guest. I enjoy talking to you. For those not familiar with Mike Arnold, he wrote the book Bringing Back the Lions, and this is about the reintroduction of lions to Crocodile 11 in Mozambique. Fantastic story, and you can hear more about that in episode 213, where Mike and I talked about that. Mike was also on in episode 253, talking about a hunt he went on in Cameroon, and then in episode 330, talking about hunting in Yala and bushbuck. But today, we are talking about hunting crocodile and spotted hyena. So you literally just got back home from this hunt. Tell us, where were you and all that? We'll talk about the hunt.
Yeah, I just finished the last load of clothes.
You're probably still a little jet lagged too, aren't you?
Well, I don't even want to talk about that. I've had a lot of espresso this morning. So I've always wanted, so here's the confession. I've always wanted to hunt a hyena. Mm-hmm. And I've really always wanted to hunt a crocodile. And I'm a biologist. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia. And I've been a biologist for a long, long time. And I love weird and wonderful things. Mm-hmm. And I love hunting weird and wonderful things. And I consider both of those species that to some degree. So at the Dallas Safari Club convention last year, I was talking to Mark Haldane, and I know they hunt crocs where they are, and I know they have in Crocodile 11, and I know also that they have one permit for hyena. But I realized that the likelihood of me hunting either one of those there with him was low. So I was asking Mark, because he's my go-to guy, I was actually asking him for recommendation with someone else. Well, he said, well, have I told you we have a new area in Mozambique? And I said, I don't know. I had a vague memory of it. And I said, okay, tell me about it. And he said, well, it's called Messenger. And it's in the Messenger district in far southern, way south of where Crocodile 11 is. And it's in the dry area. It's Mopani scrub. And it's spitting distance from both Kruger in South Africa and Limpopo National Park in Mozambique. So that might give some folks an idea. So it's down in that corner. Anyway, he said, we have this new concession down there. We also hunt the lake. It's Lake Messenger, a huge freaking lake. It's 60 miles long or so. And he said it's got crocs all over it, and we have permits. And he said, and we also have a hyena problem on the Plains game and Buffalo area that we have there. And he said, so we have permits for that if you're interested. And I said, heck yeah. So that's where I hunted. And that's why I hunted there. Like I say, I thought he would tell me, oh, you need to go with so-and-so. But he had an area now. And they've only been hunting it, just to put a little, I don't know, a little information here in it, since 23. So they've had very few clients come through. Yeah. Man, the buffalo, Jiminy crickets, the buffalo that they have in there. I took a photo of a bunch of young ones that they wouldn't be hunting yet. Those things were like 45 inches wide. I mean, they were huge, huge freaking buffalo. Like I say, for those of you listening to this, they would not let you shoot those. They don't shoot young buffalo. They let them grow up and pass their genes on. And as a conservation biologist, I applaud that. But anyway, that's why I went there.
So I went on an adventure in Mozambique in 2017, and I went through Massengier, and I crossed over to Mozambique through the Giriando crossing in Kruger Park. So I drove through Kruger Park, crossed there, drove through Massengier, and I remember that area had a reputation for fantastic crocodile hunting.
Yeah.
It seems like in Mozambique, there's two places where it's just great. It's there, and then at Cahora Bassa. And so it sounds like, and from looking at the crocodile picture you sent me, that there are really nice crocodile there.
The lake is infested. I mean, it really is. Mark and their goal is to get their clients 12 to 15 foot crocodiles. That's their range. I mean, I would have been happy with 9 foot. I mean, I wanted the skull out of it, just to tell your viewers. Once again, I'm a nerd from a museum background, and I love skulls. So that's what I was headed for. And so anyway, and they were going to use the skin for some other things through Mark. But anyway, yeah, so 12 to 15. Obviously, it takes 70, maybe 80 years to get a 15-foot croc grown to that. Even with all the food they have. And so they're not going to have all of them be 15 feet long, but they had a lot of big crocs there. Lots of big crocs in the water.
Well, tell us about your hunt.
Well, so it was in 2 phases. And my sweet wife was with me as my photographer, videographer. All of those great photographs I sent to you and everybody else when I was so excited, they came from Frances. She is a non-hunter, by the way, but she loves adventure, and she's not against hunting. She's not an anti-hunter. So anyway, it was in 2 phases. The first phase was a baiting phase. We had 3 days to hunt the crocs because we also had to go to South Africa and do some conservation work. So we had a limited time, about 6 days there in camp in Massengier. And so the first night, and we'll go back to this, I think, later on the hyena. The first night we went out and we got a hyena for me, which was bucket list animal. I was so excited. And then we used that hyena as bait, along with the head off of a blue wildebeest that they had shot for camp meat. Okay, I hadn't shot it, but they'd collected it for camp meat. So it took us 2 to 3 hours, 3.5 hours to actually arrive, first by 4-wheel drive, and then we got into a rowboat, and they rowed us around to an island that Dylan, my PH, Dylan Holmes, had named Alcatraz. And the lake level, and this becomes important later, the lake level was very high, very, very high, which means that you have very few sunning areas for the crocs to come out on. And of course, you need those. Even if you're baiting them in, you got to have some land for them to get onto, because you're not going to shoot them in the water. And so, or they'll sink. And so we went to Alcatraz, and I've got to tell you, so we're rowing over there, first time out, and these were fishermen, but they were also acting as a water taxi for us. One's name was Shadrach, and the other was Lucky. Okay. And Shadrach and Lucky are rowing Francis and me and all the equipment and everything. And there are crocodiles in the water, the silhouettes of crocodiles in the water, and a few basking on a few little spits of land. And I looked at Frances and I said, sweetie, are you nervous at all? And she said, why would I be nervous? We're in a crocodile infested lake surrounded by angry hippos. The boat has a slow leak, which it did. And she said, I'm loaded down with about $8,000 of very heavy video and camera equipment. And I'm going to go to the bottom like a rock. And I said, well, at least you're not nervous. And so anyway, they got us to the island and we got out and they built the blind out of brush and grass. And then they cabled, y'all have probably seen this on videos or whatever shows. They cabled the hyena carcass and the blue wildebeest, and then they chummed. We're in the blind, and the tracker albino threw out blood and threw out offal, threw out intestines and stuff. And the whole idea was for that to drift out with the current. And any crocodile, didn't matter. And Dylan had said this, we don't care if it's small, big, anything. He said, we just want one to come in, grab it, thrash around. And he said, that noise will bring all the others. Well, I've never hunted crocodiles in my life, so I wondered how this would work. And it worked to perfection, though, that day, except we didn't get a crocodile. But so this little one came in, bumped it with his nose, grabbed it, and thrashed around. And then it looked like I reckoned it looked like the landing at Normandy. All the ships were coming in. You could see the wakes of all these crocodiles coming from all over the lake. They heard that. They recognized the noise, I guess. They're very wily. And we got a couple of huge ones in, but they never gave us a shot. They never gave us a shot where they were not laying basically over the edge into the deep water. They were just grabbing the meat, thrashing around, grabbing a chunk, moving back into the deep water. And we just never got a shot. Mm-hmm. But it was all heck broke loose when they all got there. They were fighting with one another. They were banging into one another. The water just exploded with crocs feeding off of this stuff. But they finished it, and that was it. They all headed back home. And the next day, we tried again, but the current was wrong, and the wind was wrong. So the chum never got out into the lake. Nothing came in. We sat there for, 6 or 7 hours. So Dylan said, look, we've got one more day. He said, it's so limited land. He said, there really isn't a lot of shoreline you've seen. But so instead, though, they have an aluminum boat. And he said, we're going to take the aluminum boat and we're going to cruise. And we're going to hope that we can see one up somewhere where we can get onto the land behind it or whatever and spot and stalk. And we tried once and we got blown out by a smaller croc. It was a nice croc there. We would have taken it, but it blew out. And this sounds like this article's coming out in Sportsfield. I told Diana, I'm not making this up. Diana Rupp, the editor, I'm really not making this up. It sounds like, on the last day and the last moments before sun, and it really was. So we were going into the last cove, and I was pretty discouraged. But we were checking out each cove as we went back to our boat landing launching place. And Dylan turned the corner into this cove, and the other bank's about 200 yards away. And all he said, he and Albino, put their glasses up, their optics up, and looked, and he said, there's a croc over there. There were actually two, both shooters. But anyway, Frances and I raised our eyes and glanced. I never even raised my Vortex binocular rangefinder to my eyes. And I said, I'm real subtle. Holy crap, that's a big crocodile. And how Jack O'Connor said the big ones look big. I was just thinking that. They just looked huge. This thing looked enormous. It was bigger than anything I had seen, larger than any crocodile I'd seen. And I am a novice, okay? These were the first crocodiles I'd ever seen in my life when we got to the lake, okay? Mm-hmm. So I am not an expert. But anyway, Dylan said, yeah, that's a monster. And he said, and the bad part is, though, there's no way we can spot and stalk that thing. He said, there's nowhere for us to land, and there's no way we can get up to it with all the brush around it without spooking it. And he said that other one, which was to the right of it, is a good one, too. And he said, that's a shooter too. And I said, well, either one's fine. But anyway, I said, look, and I had told him I do not want to shoot from the boat because you're trying to hit a lemon-sized object, either the spine or the brain. and it's got to really, you got to be stable. But we had talked about it, and I said, look, why don't you paddle towards it and let's see, because we figured we'd blow it out of there. Mm-hmm. And they started paddling, and I kept ranging it. We set up a rest for me on the bow, on the flat bow, so that I had a life jacket, and then I put Francis's backpack that was emptied of everything on top of that, and then I laid down across it basically. And I kept ranging, and it got down to 140, and it got down to 130, and then it got down to 110, and finally it got down to 101 yards. And Dylan leaned forward and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "It's real stable. There was no wind. There was nothing chopping the water." I said, look, if we can get the bow stabilized, I think I can take the shot. And I was shooting an R8, a Blauser R8 in 300 Win Mag, and I was shooting Hornady's 200 ELDX bullets. And I have real confidence in these darn things. I've used them a lot. I used that exact load on Cape Eland and took it down with one shot. So I knew the darn thing would work. And It was a very accurate rifle. I'd been shooting it a lot at the range. So anyway, Frances is filming this thing. It's the most hilarious thing. She's videoing it. And Dylan turns around and says to Albino, when they get me set, to Albino and Frances, and says, "Don't breathe."
Yeah.
And I was like, thank you, Jesus. So anyway, took the shot. I was aiming for the spine. He was slightly quartering away, and actually it got his spine, fractured it. And we found out the hydro shock just popped the skull just a little bit, and there was a little bit of blood. It almost looked like a brain shot, but it wasn't. And then I shot him. Dylan said, "Reload, shoot him behind the shoulder or shoot him in the shoulder," and I shot him there. And then we got up to the land. He was still third in the water, though. He thrashed around, and his back third. He weighed about 1,500 pounds, and was the estimate. And we had there was an old white guy, me, on a rope, and then two young guys who were real strong, fortunately, on other ropes, just trying to scoot the darn thing up out of the water so the other Crocs wouldn't come in and grab him and try to pull him off. So, but that was how we got him, and it was amazing.
For the listener, I'll show shot placement on a Crocodile. Like you said, it's a lemon-sized target. I've heard it described as a golf ball-sized target, but either way, it's really small. And
it is really tiny, and we were 101 yards away. I'll still remember that red dial in my Vortex rangefinder, with it blinking 101 yards, thinking, Arnold, you said you wouldn't want to shoot these darn things more than 25 yards away, and that was on land. But once again, incredibly accurate rifle. All right, let's face it. Really, a PH and a tracker, and my sweet wife being very careful, and it was a calm day. If it had been a choppy day, it would have been impossible. It was, it was a non-perfect storm. It worked, kind of thing. It was, but I honestly, I would recommend our bait site, for example, was 25 yards from the bait, blind to bait. That's the distance.
Yeah.
I believe, to try to shoot a croc, but sometimes you just, in a hunting field, time, you just can't get there. So.
Yeah, as you were talking about, like, everyone trying to be still in the boat, I was picturing, like, me being in a boat with my two kids and them jumping around and that
wouldn't have worked. That would have. First of all, I don't think we would have gotten, if my grandson had been there, I don't think there's any way we would have gotten within 1.5 miles of that crocodile, let alone where we did. No, it was. But I'll tell you, great adventure, and it was wonderful to see both the baiting methodology, as well as cruising around and trying to spot and stalk, and then, having to shoot from the boat. We got everything, every kind of method you could get, we got.
Now, did that ELDX bullet exit the Crocodile?
They found no part of the ELDX in there when they were skinning out the skull and looking at the neck area. So the answer is yes. It did. Now, what an ELDX does, though, for your listeners, and I've written several reviews on this bullet and they're from hunts. I've never had a failure with that bullet, and I can honestly say that. We all will have failures with any bullet we use. So one of these days I will, but I have not had it. Everything from eland down to Steinbach or white-tailed deer or whatever. So what the ELDX I have found, though, is what happens is that front portion of it basically vaporizes, but it's little bitty bits. And the base, the leaves fold back. And when you recover one, I recovered it off my Hyena, interestingly enough, everything's folded back. The base is still there intact. You get about 50% weight retention, and that front portion is completely gone. And the reason what happens is, it happened on my leopard back when I hunted in Namibia. I hit it on the point of the shoulder that exited, the bullet's base and all of the rest of it exited. But when you rubbed your hand on the other side of that leopard, the exit part, there were no big holes, but the whole side of that leopard was hemorrhaged. And so that's why I think that bullet works so darn well, is it holds together. You get 50% of the bullet, so in this case 100 grains, that is powering through, and the front end is acting like, I don't know, claymore mind or something. You know, and it works. It works when you hit bone. It works. I've shot hogs with it anyway. But yeah, that's what I was using.
So I obviously I've never shot a crocodile at all. I've shot a handful of animals with the ELDX bullet in various cartridges. I've never recovered one, like you said, and I've never had a bad experience with one. That's a polarizing bullet. Some people don't like it. Some people claim it blah, blah, blah explodes. And I'm sure that does happen from time to time, but that is interesting and heartening that you were able to shoot a thick-skinned animal like a big crocodile like that. And have it work. I know lots of crocodiles have been killed with 30 caliber rifles, like your 300 Win Mag, and really, especially with that head or spine shot. In your case, you put the bullet where it needs to go, and it either works or it doesn't.
Yeah, and the other part of this is that I didn't want to take the brain shot because I wanted the skull, so I didn't want to explode it. But I did tell Dylan, look, on that last day, I said, look, dude, I want to get the crocodile. And if I have to have the taxidermist put in a bunch of fake bone, that's okay. Let's take a brain shot if we have to. But I didn't end up having to do that. But one thing about that bullet, to go back, the reason I had confidence is I've used it so darn much in a lot of different calibers. But that specific bullet, 200 grain ELDX, is what I took a Cape Eland with. And it was a one-shot kill from 325 yards away. And I knew the darn thing, and it exited. We didn't find the bullet. But I do find them occasionally. I found my 7mm rim mag when I shot a sable in Katata 11. It was on the other side. It smashed the spine, and it's 50% weight retention, and it was just inside the skin. So, there are other great bullets out there, by the way. There's just other great bullets. Hornady and everybody else out there can make some great bullets. So I don't think, if someone's uncomfortable with it, use another bullet kind. Use something you're confident in. I think that's the take home.
Now, I think there's a lot of people that will maybe hunt crocodile on a buffalo hunt, and you're using your 375 and whatever your buffalo bullet is, and that'll work great. But in a case where you're specifically going after crocodile, that does change things a little bit. That is interesting that you recovered it from the Hyena, and we'll talk more about that in a second after we wrap things up with the Croc. Can you show us with your hands about how big that skull is going to be when you get it?
Yeah, I should send you a photo. I'm not even sure I can do it. It would be, in terms of width, and I don't have real broad shoulders, but probably the width of the skull is going to be about like my shoulders.
Wow.
The length is, I don't even know. The length is going to be, I can't do it. But he was, so I sent the photo, ironically or interestingly, and I don't think Craig will mind this. I sent it to Craig, and I said, Craig Boddington, and I said, Craig, look what I got, and he wrote back and said, that's a beautiful croc. That's what we call a fatty.
Yeah.
And he is, I guess, that's why he weighed so darn much. We estimate that the locals, one of the things that we always have to emphasize is the meat off of all of these things. I always want to encourage folks to realize, and someone might think, well, I assume you just cut the head off and threw the rest of it away or something, but we don't. They don't. They probably got about, estimating from, I'm a scientist nerd, estimating from the graphs that I have, they probably got about 650 pounds of meat off of that thing.
Jeez.
A lot of it from the tail, but other parts. And we found in our, not a scientific survey, but just asking folks, about half of the folks on the lake ate croc meat. The other half didn't, but there were tons of folks around who wanted it. So sadly, the other part of this story is that when we were dragging him up and we were getting all the photographs, Dylan said, by the way, I just want to let you know this croc ate a farmer about 3 weeks ago. We're pretty certain he was the one that was seen right across the way where we had been. Farmer had waded down into the water like he'd been doing every day, and he was taken. And he said this was the croc in the area. And so being a very insensitive idiot, later on when I was talking to him, I said, oh, did they ever open up the stomach? He said, Mike, of course they didn't open up the stomach. They knew what they were going to find.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad we got rid of him. My wife said, well, at least he's not going to eat anybody else. But it makes you cringe. At least it does me, watching those little kids playing in the water or getting stuff, the ladies washing clothes, the men out there gathering water. Oh my Lord, with that croc infested lake, but anyway, it's, they've got a rough life. So,
when you look up, the deadliest animals in Africa and all of that, hippo always comes out at the top of the list as far as mammals, big game animals and whatnot go. But I mean, croc are right behind them. Thousands of people.
Yeah. One of the publications I pulled up when I was getting ready for the trip, because I love looking at the data on things like this. There was a survey for about 25 months in Mozambique in two different areas, like you said, Cabora Bassa and actually the Delta around Tata 11, basically that Zambezi Delta. And they surveyed how many people have been, killed by different of the lions and elephants and crocs and hippos, and crocs came up on top, actually, unfortunately, sadly. I mean, but anyway, they accounted for something like 66% of all the deaths. And I think it's because people are associated with, they have to go to the water. And the crocs are wily. They know what paths folks are traveling. And so they just wait.
Goodness gracious. You hear stories about that. And I had Kevin Robertson on the show in episode 178 talking about hunting crocodiles and their biology. And he says it's not at all uncommon to kill a crocodile and, find out at some point that it had killed a person, sometimes real recently, sometimes much further in the past. But that's a fact of life over there. And I'm glad at least that one is not going to be eating any more locals. Let's switch gears a little bit. Tell us about this hyena that you ended up taking, gosh, on your first day of hunting.
Yeah, I mean, once again, a great concession area. Mark Haldane always comes up with them, it seems like. But so once again, I read Ruark, and I've always had a desire to hunt certain animals. And two of those, because of him, have been a leopard and a hyena. And so I've waited for years and finally fell into this. But the thing about hunting hyenas in this area is, and hyenas are, if you look at the structure of their eye, they have the cones and the rod distribution in their eyes, and eye doctors are out there going, oh, wow, he's talking about this. But they have those, and it doesn't surprise professional hunters or outfitters over there at all, but they have the eyes of an animal that's a nocturnal animal. And so the way they hunt them is they hunt them sort of like we do for coyotes, except it's at night, and they use a collar. And he used a Fox Pro. My PH Dylan used a Fox Pro, and he had a handheld thermal that he used to look around as he's using this collar. So it was just like sitting on a coyote stand, sort of, except what was coming out of that collar didn't sound like any coyote you would have ever heard. It sounded like hyenas. And so to do the hunt, I had the rifle, I had a scope, but I had to have a thermal attachment of some sort. And Blauser has one that they offer. They don't build it, but they sell it with their scopes and the rifle scopes, and it's made by Lemke. It's a Luchs, LUCHS1, I think it is. But anyway, this is the other part. I'd never hunted a crocodile, and I sure hadn't tried to shoot one at 100 yards. Well, I'd never, ever in my life, and I know, John, you have, I'm certain everybody else has, I'd never looked through a thermal. In my life, I had never looked through a thermal. I sure hadn't hunted with one. Mm-hmm. So of course I'm going, I told Larry Weissing on his show and somebody else, I said, you talk about Mike Arnold setting himself up to have two, train wrecks, with a Croc that he's never hunted and then trying to use a thermal for the first time. And I had heard that thermals, I don't know, everybody out there who's used one is going to say, well, that's not right. But I had heard over and over again that the definition of looking through a thermal, all you saw was like a blob. And you couldn't define anything and all this. Well, that, by the way, is not correct. Maybe it is for some thermals, but the one I was using, you could see definition, you could see the muscles, you could see the shoulder, you could see everything. And I'm sure everybody who's out there who's used a thermal, a real live one that works, says, well, of course, that's exactly how they work. But I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we put it on. The first day we got in there.
And so just so I understand, This is a clip-on thermal. You take your regular scope, the rifle's sighted in with it, you put a thermal on the end of it, and you don't. That's it.
You slip it on, it calibrates with the scope, and because it's built for the Blausers, so yes, that's all you do. And the other cool thing is, and I should say this, that although we didn't link Dylan's phone to that thermal, I believe you can Bluetooth it in. He Bluetoothed it with his handheld thermal, so we were able to watch the hyenas through his handheld thermal on his phone, on his iPhone. But yeah, that's all you do. You slip it on, and the way you sight it in, because you're shooting in during the day, usually, you're at the range, you check it on paper. He put a piece of aluminum foil which gathered the heat better than the paper, and so that square was what I shot at, and it showed up, and that's how we checked to make sure that it was on through the thermal, which it was. It was dead on, and Blauser products work. I mean, they tend to really work well together. So yeah, we slipped it on, waited till close to dark, and we had 4 sets. Coyote hunters, predator hunters know what that means. We set up 4 times and called. The first 2, we had no response. And they were, we waited about 20, we called for about, or Dylan did, for about 20 minutes each time. Set 1 was 8:10 or so, 8:10 at night. And then set 2 was whenever, 8:25 or whatever. And then we drove on to set 3. And as he was playing the pup in distress, hyena pup in distress, and 10 seconds in, they went off. We heard them. And they were calling. Francis asked, did you hear that Cape Buffalo huff at you? Was upset with your calling. And I said, yeah, I did. And Dylan said, y'all, that wasn't a Cape Buffalo. That was the hyena. And I didn't know hyenas huffed. I had never, I guess, listened to a soundtrack of hyena best hits or something. But so all of these noises they called, but so there were 2 of them. And Dylan was showing us in his phone through his handheld thermal. And I was on the sticks and I was ready. But the problem was those darn hyenas were on the other side of an electrified fence in somebody else with their fence, in somebody else's property, on somebody else's property where they weren't allowing hunting. So we were not allowed to take that shot because they were inside that guy's fence line. And we were hoping, and it didn't work, but maybe they would come through under the fence, but they didn't. They finally got tired of us fiddling with them and they wandered off. So we went down the road, and Dylan said, look, don't worry about it. There's lots of hyenas out here, and there's some, they're obviously on our side of their fence too. So I said, okay. We went down, and he hadn't even started calling when we parked again, and they started calling around us. And they had obviously it was another pair, and it probably, according to Dylan, what he surmised is they were probably coming into our third set, but now we were on our fourth. And he put me on the sticks again, looked through the scope, and I saw both of the dogs. Or actually, that's the interesting thing. We call them dogs. They're actually more closely related to cats, believe it or not. I know. Go figure.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, they were coming in, and I said, do I take the shot? Which one do you want me to take? And he said, no, there's brush in front of it. And it's interesting, John, if you've probably used those thermals, that's the one way I messed up on them, is that I was too tunnel visioned. I saw the white, perfect outline of that hyena. And in retrospect, I think I remember seeing the black sticks in front of it, right? Mm-hmm. Branches in front of it, but it didn't register with me. And so it was so good to have Dylan. He was looking through his handheld, and he said, no, there's brush in the way. And I said, I don't see the brush, whispered back. But anyway, he let it clear, and then I took the shot. And it turned out to be the females are much larger than the males. They're bigger than the males. A lot of, not many mammals are like that, but she was a huge old one. And she has I'm getting a full mount, and she has a old snare scar around her neck that's about that wide. I mean, it must have stayed on and rubbed her forever, but that shows you how tough they are.
My goodness, man. That also shows the reality of life in a lot of parts of Africa too, just how many snares there are out there.
Yep, absolutely.
And so you shot her with that 300 Win Mag, 200 grain ELDX. Did she just go straight down after the shot?
She reached back because it had a muzzle brake on it. I could see, like on the Crocodile, I could see its head flop up and flop back down. And then when I shot it in the shoulder, its reaction. So the muzzle brake on it on the Hyena allowed me to see her turn her head to bite at the point on her shoulder, and then she just collapsed. Mm-hmm. So hit her where I was supposed to. Now that was only a 50-yard shot, 50-ish. It wasn't. I said it was 40. Dylan said no, it was a little bit longer. So say 50-yard shot. And I told you we recovered the bullet. It was in the opposite shoulder, and that would seem odd, I think, to a lot of folks. How in the world on a Hyena did you recover it, but you don't recover it on an eland? Mm-hmm. When we got up there, I was stunned how solid she was. Muscle and bone, big bones, and heavy as lead. She probably weighed 130, 140 pounds. And she's a big animal. And so it also tells you how strong those darn things are. You can understand why they can kill lions. A couple of them can kill a lion, and their jaws, of course, everybody is aware of. And I'm getting the skull out of that one too. And oh my goodness, the strength of those and the length of the teeth and everything else. It was a fabulous, fabulous animal.
Yeah. And so you shot this at 50 yards and it was going, 2,800 feet per second, probably when you shot it. And at 300 yards, maybe doing 2,400-ish feet per second. So you're not going to get as wide of a wound cavity, but the bullet will penetrate a lot better going slower like that. So that's not surprising to me that you got it when you think about it like that.
I think that's exactly, well, no, I know you're exactly right. The thing that, once again, the bullet didn't come apart at 50 yards. The front end was missing. I have the bullet, and I weighed it the other day on my, if you come over for dinner, don't freak out, but I weighed it on my food. I cleaned it afterwards. And so anyway, it was exactly 100 grains. Exactly 100 grains left on that thing. It was the leaves were all folded back, and that base was there. And but I think you're right. Obviously, the penetration's just not there. but I'm serious. I was, just absolutely blown away by how stout that animal is. I just
So
thought of him as, a dog
if you had to
running
guess,
around.
how much would you say she weighed?
Well, I think she was at the top of her weight, and spotted hyenas in that area are probably about 140 pounds. I think the females are, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So about that. And so shorter, both lengthwise and height-wise, but still the same weight as a decent-sized whitetail here in Georgia. That, that's a lot of fire plug there, I guess.
Yeah. People, I think, have the wrong idea about hyenas, that at least, especially if they haven't spent a lot of time in Africa, they get the idea, I think, that they're more like coyotes
Mm-hmm.
than is actually the case. I think a jackal is much more like a coyote than a hyena is.
Exactly.
And the hyena is much bigger, and the hunting for them is much more controlled. You needed
Mm-hmm.
to get a permit and all of this stuff. And so while they are scavengers and they do some of the things that coyotes do, it's not a direct one-to-one comparison between them.
No, I think, no, what you just said is exactly accurate. They are a unique carnivore, is how
Mm-hmm.
I would put it. And like you said, you want a coyote, that's a jackal.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they're potentially a little bit smaller. Some of the jackals are smaller than coyotes, but they have the behavioral patterns. The hyenas literally are what take care of lions. If lion is hurt, and on that property, the reason they need to keep the hyena numbers down is that they hammer everything. I mean, there's nothing short of, say, a Cape buffalo or an elephant, because they have those on that property too, that is not fair game.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else, blue wildebeest, you name it, they can take those things down. And I'm not talking about just young.
Now, it's interesting that you say that. Now that I'm thinking about it too, while they may not be one-to-one with wolves may be a more apt comparison with them, where they're a big animal and they
Yep.
also hunt in a pack.
I believe that is the best analogy for North America. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so you said that you saw a couple of them in small groups. Tell me again how many animals were in those groups?
Two each. We brought them in. Within an hour, I had my hyena for hunting. So how many more would we have seen if we had stayed out? I have no clue. It's hard to get. They've had camera traps on that area, and they figure in that property they have, say, just in their concession, they probably have about 10 individuals, something like that. And that's a lot of hyenas because of how much they eat. But the two that we brought in that first time, remember, were on a different property. So there's a lot of hyenas in that area. And obviously they are in settled areas, probably taking livestock too, or
Mm-hmm.
she wouldn't have had a snare on her.
Yeah.
Because they have anti-poaching where they are, and that was an old snare. So, and they go, that other neighbor has a fence around their place, but hyenas dig under it.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll go into town basically.
So while you were mainly focused on hyena and crocodile while you were there, what other wildlife did you see?
Wow, we saw elephants, wild elephants not on that property. There are elephants on that property, but when we were in our our hide for the crocs, several came down to the lake to water. Cape buffalo were there, blue wildebeest, impalas all over the place. They had inyala, they had kudu. Trying any of the animals that you think of as being stereotypical in a drier area, like in Catata 11, you don't get kudu, as you know. And so let's see. What I'm trying to remember is I don't think we saw a giraffe there, but I bet they have them in that area because it's perfect habitat for them. But those are the ones that I can think off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, very interesting. Well, let's switch gears from this and tell us about your new book that you have.
Well, it's called my agent in New York. I got him to read it, the final manuscript, and I said, and I think I've told you this, I tell all of the podcast folks and all my friends. So whenever I send an article into Diana Rupp or to Safari Magazine or anywhere else, or send a book into someone and with the title, it always changes because I suck at coming up with titles. I'm not, hey, I have no self-esteem issues about this. Everybody tells me that. Diana Rupp just looks at me and shakes her head. She doesn't even bother anymore telling me how bad I am at it. So I sent the book to my agent and I said, and I had a title on it. I'm not even going to tell you what it is because it's embarrassing, I guess. But anyway, he came up with the title. The main title is Bring Back the Wild. And so he said it links you. Your book is not about Cantata 11 only, but it links your Bringing Back the Lions. And he said, I think that's a good way. And it's an excellent title. Everybody else has loved it to pieces. But the book is a worldwide look in the sense, and now when I say worldwide, I don't have the Southeast Pacific, or South Pacific, I should say. I lived in Australia for 6 years. I should know what it's called. So, but what I do have is I've traveled around from Yucatan Peninsula and Mexico all through North America into British Columbia and that sort of thing, into Europe and a bunch of different countries, of course, in Africa. And I looked at the various models they had for conservation through hunting. So I also looked at the science, and hopefully people will understand if they read my magazine articles. I like to, sort of like Jack O'Connor used to do, and I'm not like Jack O'Connor, but anyway, he used to insert some biology into his things, and I like that, and I like doing that. So there's a little bit of biology in there, a little bit of science about what we're hunting. But I also miss the books that I used to read when I was younger, books by Jack O'Connor and articles by Jack O'Connor and by Ruark and by other folks. And so Diana Rupp asked me, she was the editor of this one, just like she was Bringing Back the Lions. And she said, what is your goal? And I said, I wanted to produce stories that people are going to enjoy that do have a point about conservation through hunting, but I want them to enjoy the hunt. I want them to get inside of the hunt for the brocket deer in the Yucatan Peninsula and that bird that's back there, the crested guan that's back on top of my rifle.
Move your head so people can see what you're talking about.
Bird right back there, guys.
And so that lives in Mexico?
Yeah, that was from Yucatan. I had two birds I wanted there, so anyway, great curassow, which I'm looking up there. Y'all can't see that, and then the crested guan. But I want to get them inside those hunts and to feel the excitement of those hunts, just like I try to do in magazine articles. So the book Bringing Back the Wild should come out. Well, it'll be out in July. The audio version of it, we'll have the Kindle and the hard copy, I call it, but the paperback will come out in July. Audiobook should be out in July as well. It should be done in about 5 weeks. So everything will be on Amazon, and it'll be, print on demand at Ingram Sparks for those who are overseas and that sort of thing. Or they'll be able to order it off of my website, and then those I'll be able to sign. And we'll have some book signings at various places as well. So that's the new one. And
okay,
I'm very glad to have it done.
Well, excellent. I really enjoyed Bringing Back the Lions. I will put a link in the episode description where people can go pick up a copy of Bringing Back the Lions and Bringing Back the Wild. It's always a pleasure having you on the show, Mike. And actually, I almost forgot to ask you this question. So this is the question that I am asking everyone that comes on the show this year. And I did not prep you for this. So it's okay. It's okay if you need to take a second to think about it. But you must choose one to hunt with for the rest of your life. Anything and everything that you may be hunting with. You can choose either a single cartridge, and you can use any bullet in that cartridge, or a single bullet and use that single bullet in any cartridge. So you could use the Hornady ELDX, for instance, in a 243 and a 338 Lapua and a 300 Win Mag if you wanted, or you can go with, for instance, a 30-06 and hunt everything with it. So what is your choice? Either is it the single cartridge or the single bullet? And then what is the actual decision there?
Yeah, so this is going to sound odd because I've really only hunted with this cartridge one time.
Mhm.
On one safari, and that was in Cameroon, and it was a 375 H&H. I'm about to purchase one, and so people are going to ask, why in the world? Well, once again, gun writers for an awful long time have talked about the utility of that cartridge, and I have some hunts coming up that I know that I'll be shooting from, say, 400 or less.
Mhm.
And I trust that cartridge because what I shot in Cameroon went all the way from a tiny little red flank diker all the way up to a Savannah buffalo, Western Savannah buffalo. And every one of them was handled well with that cartridge. And I can get solids because I'm trying to plan an elephant hunt. I can get solids for it, and I can use soft points for other things. So that's going to be my choice. No, it sounds crazy because I just haven't hunted with it that much, but I was so impressed with the proof of what other folks have been, with the other giants whose shoulders I'm standing on had told me for years.
Well, you are in good company with other people choosing the 375 H&H as well. That is the single most popular bullet or cartridge choice from everyone that's been on the podcast this year.
Mm-hmm.
So it may be crazy to some people, but not to the audience of this podcast. So I think that's an excellent choice, and I cannot fault your reasoning whatsoever for it. So as we wrap up, tell us briefly about what the future holds for you. You mentioned you have a couple of other hunts coming up.
Yeah, so this year there's a couple of things. I'm going to be reviewing a new rifle, I believe, for Blouser. It's going to be coming in. It's Sauer 505, and I'm going to go back out to Oklahoma. I'd like to hunt what's called a mule-footed hog.
I've never heard
And
of that.
yeah, I know. And the reason it's called a mule-footed hog is because it doesn't have a split hoof on it. It's a real weird domesticated thing that they brought across from Spain back in the 1500s, and then the Choctaws and Cherokee Indians on the Trail of Tears from the southeast U.S. Took it across to Oklahoma when they were resettled by us white people, and they took those animals, and they are just a cool animal. And so I'd like to hunt with this Sauer 505 in Oklahoma. That'd probably be in the middle of the year, that sort of thing. And then in October, we go to Scotland, and we're going to be hunting in the Highlands for native red deer. So they're not introduced. That's where they come from, and Sika deer, and then probably another roebuck. And those are the three species we'll go across and do. And then the following year, who the heck knows right now?
Okay. Well, that's still some good hunts you got coming up. We'll get you back on once you've got them behind you, and maybe we can talk about them. As we wrap up, where can people go to learn more about what's going on with you?
So MikeArnoldOutdoors.com. That gets you to my website. You'll see all the stuff about the material about the new book and status of that. You can order Bringing Back the Lions, and you'll get us. Like I say, I don't see the Amazon or the Ingram Sparks. Y'all just go there, and that's perfectly fine if you order them there. But I don't get to sign them, and I'll sign you a copy if you order them off of my website.
All right, Mike. It was a pleasure having you on. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you so much again, John.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Like I mentioned, links to Mike's website and to the Amazon listing for his book, Bringing Back the Lions, and his Now, go to thebiggamehuntingblog.com/Mike Arnold or click on the link in the pinned comment on YouTube or in the episode description. That will take you to an Amazon page where you can pick up a copy of Bringing Back the Lions, which was Mike's first book about reintroducing lions to Cutada 11 in Mozambique. You can also pick up a copy of Mike's latest book, Bringing Back the Wild, at that same location. That book tells similar stories of conservation successes at locations all over the world. Like I said, both are available at thebiggamehuntingblog.com/Mike Arnold. And finally, if you are ready to book your dream hunt in Africa, visit bestsafarihunt.com or email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com. I will set you up with an amazing hunt. And like I said, be sure to tell me you are a podcast listener when you contact me about a hunt. I will give you a special bonus. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.